Narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is 9:08 p.m. in a dark, dark, miserable, wet, cold, dismal November evening in Budapest. But I won't go on. I will just simply congratulate um, our American listeners on Thanksgiving. I hope everyone who's in the United States or who celebrates American holidays wherever they are is having a very good Thanksgiving. I don't celebrate Thanksgiving. It never appealed to me very much, even when I lived in the United States. I mean, I like the idea, but I've always been more of a Christmas person. So Christmas always, I think, is means a lot more. But Americans go for Thanksgiving. But anyway, congratulations on Thanksgiving. And obviously, there's a number of things, however, that we can discuss. And one thing that I want to get to, obviously, at some length, but is the meeting in Astana of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, a completely meaningless body, incidentally. It's supposed to be the Russian version of NATO. But the last thing anyone does at the CSTO is invoke any kind of Article 5. So Russia has been fighting what Russia considers to be an existential war against the West now for almost 3 years. And the one thing that we can say with certainty is that the Collective Security Treaty Organization has done very little to assist. And if anything, they've kind of been a little on the other side. I mean, Kazakhstan has done very little, even in terms of economic support. But anyway, be that as it may. So there was the meeting of the CSTO today in Astana, and then Putin gave a news conference. And so we'll talk about this news conference in some detail in a bit. But the one amusing thing that I want to bring up is that Putin was asked about Angela Merkel's memoirs, and as you know, we did a whole podcast on this uh, over the weekend, and as you know, she in her memoirs brings up yet again this subject of their meeting some years ago about the just see said W says it's snowing here. I think that's really miserable. Not a huge fan of snow either. But um, but anyway, so she visited Putin, and then Putin had brought out his big black Labrador, and apparently she, Angela Merkel, has a phobia about dogs, and was very uncomfortable with this black Labrador. Now, I've heard this story, I don't know how many times, I don't get over the years, and the media have repeated, and to be honest, I mean, they're just repeating what she asserted at the time. I think it was either 2005 or 2007. I can't remember the exact date. Well, that Putin knew that she had a phobia about dogs, and that Putin deliberately brought out this black Labrador in order to intimidate her. Now, I never really believed this story very much because I couldn't understand why Putin would want to um, upset, annoy, and irritate, intimidate Angela Merkel. I mean, if there's one thing we know about Putin, is that he was obsessed from the earliest time that he assumed the presidency. He was obsessed with ensuring Russian economic development, and it kind of makes sense. A huge country like Russia with its enormous landmass, its enormous mineral and natural resources, its huge uh, fertile agricultural land. Russia should be an economic powerhouse, and he was determined to make Russia into an economic powerhouse. And for that, he needed German investment and German scientific and technical know-how. And he was very determined on securing this, and he was hoping that his kind of personal rapport with Angela Merkel would facilitate this, because she had grown up in the east of Germany. She was a fluent Russian speaker. At least that's what people say about her. I mean, she certainly studied Russian in school. And he, of course, having spent time in Germany, he was a fluent German speaker. So they would have a natural, easy rapport. So therefore, it never seemed to make sense why he would want to upset her. And yet again, and this was early days. So this wasn't even after relations began to deteriorate following the Maidan coup. But anyway, she was absolutely convinced that Putin had known that she had a phobia about dogs, and that Putin had deliberately brought this black lab out, and this black lab was just sort of wandering around. Uh, now, um, black, Labradors are very gentle dogs. I mean, if you want to intimidate someone, I mean, you don't bring out a lab. I mean, you bring out a German Shepherd, or you bring out a Doberman, a pit bull. I mean, a lab isn't going to scare anyone. Um, but she has been going on about this for years and years and years. And so when Putin was asked today about this, well, she's brought this up in her memoirs. What do you think of that? And they said, well, yeah, I don't know. She's been going on about this for years. The amount of energy she's devoted to this. She should really have devoted this energy to something else. And he said that yes, this happened. She did say to him afterwards, after this incident with the lab, that she had a phobia about dogs. Apparently, she had been bitten by a dog as a child, and Putin apologized to her, and he said that he didn't know, very sorry. But even so, even though he had offered his apologies, she's been going on and on about this for years, and the media have been repeating this for years and years, saying that this is a, a perfect illustration of the. Marty puts up grrr. He puts a picture. I think that's Johnny Apple. But they look very alike, Johnny Apple and Buddy. So yeah, yeah, but I guess if you're a phobia of dogs, you would probably be scared of Chihuahuas as well. And I mean, I'm scared of Chihuahuas, but of these particular Chihuahuas, because they give me such a hard time. But it's not. But not. I'm not scared of if it was just by themselves. But it's still interesting, and it shows a certain trivial mindedness of Merkel to go on about this after so many years. I mean, we're talking about it's almost 20 years since this happened, and she's still preoccupied with it, and she's still determined to use this story of the Labrador to denounce Putin, who for some reason, best known to I guess Merkel, wanted to scare Merkel. Again, it's like, but Putin said, "Look, I was under the impression that Germans liked dogs, and the Germans liked big dogs." And it is true. I mean, there's so many pictures, um, over the years of prominent Germans, accompanied by dogs, and nearly always, big dogs, like there's a reason why they're called German shepherds. Usually, Germans are accompanied by German shepherds. But she's clearly it wasn't one of them, and but Putin very graciously extended an invitation to Angela Merkel. Said, "Well, why don't you come over? And I promise I'm not going to have a dog. I'm not going to bring out any dogs. So you can come over. We can have a nice chat. And there'll be no dog joining us." So, um, but anyway, that was the more humorous aspect. Now, on the less humorous aspect of that news conference, um, so you recall last week, after Biden gave the go-ahead for the use of for Ukraine's use of the ATACMS deep inside Russian territory. So you recall, and Russia then released that the Oreshnik missile, an intermediate range ballistic missile, which is MIRVed, multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicle, so that each missile can hit many different targets. So that was Putin's response to the ATACMS. However, it was a very gentle response because basically, the whatever firepower was on those missiles, they were blanks. So in other words, they caused minimum amount of damage. But obviously, the goal was not to cause any damage. The goal was to intimidate the West. Hey, look what we've got. You walked away from the INF treaty, the Intermediate Range Missile Treaty, and now we've got our intermediate range missiles, and look what we've got. Now, he accompanied that with a speech to the Russian people, in which he said that because these ATACMS can only be used and targeted and guided by Western NATO technicians and Western NATO satellite technology. Therefore, an attack with the ATACMS on Russian territory means that NATO is effectively at war with Russia, and therefore we consider ourselves that we have the right to hit military installations in NATO countries that provide weapons to Ukraine. So this was a dramatic announcement when we talked about it at length last week, and obviously we've been now expecting. Okay, well, what's going to happen next? Will this deter Ukraine? Will this deter NATO? Now that they've had this threat from Putin, and some of the Xenon crowd were kind of doing their usual high fives and backslapping, thinking, "No, this has really intimidated NATO." Well, of course, it did nothing of the sort. NATO didn't take these threats terribly seriously. On the contrary, Keir Starmer said that we will continue to provide Ukraine with our medium-range missiles, the Storm Shadows, and there will be no restrictions on their use. We intend to stick with Ukraine until Ukraine wins. Not as long as it takes, but until Ukraine wins. And then the French, who in the middle of a political crisis over the budget, they still took time out to announce that they were also removing all restrictions on the use of their Scalp, also intermediate range missiles. Um, so that was the statements out of NATO in response to Putin's declaration, and then Ukraine just continued using the ATACMS and continued to attack um, Russian targets around Kursk with gay abandon. So the threat that Putin issued obviously had no effect. Um, it hadn't served to deter NATO. So then we say, well, what's Putin going to do now? I mean, he promised that that there'll be he's ready to hit targets inside NATO territory. So today, Putin said, yeah, we responded, all right. We responded. We've been hitting Ukraine like there's no tomorrow. And in fact, they have been. Today was been a heavy day of bombing of Ukraine, and they've been mostly targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which is what Russia always does whenever one of its red lines are crossed. Russia, just like when they bombed the Kerch Bridge, then Russia responded. This was supposedly a red line. Russia responded by hitting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. So it launched today these attacks. But there's a real problem here, which is we don't doubt that Russia can and will and has hit Ukraine. And it's been doing this now for almost 3 years. Sometimes more heavily, sometimes a little less heavily. But that isn't really the source of Russia's problems, as Putin has explained, and as Lavrov has explained. The source of their problems is NATO, and NATO's refusal to stop escalating. And NATO has refused to stop escalating because NATO isn't afraid of Russia. NATO believes it has Putin's number. NATO believes that Russia is unwilling to take the risk of an armed confrontation with NATO. And so therefore, NATO's view is that Putin is bluffing. And that's been the long-standing view of NATO, and that's a real problem for Russia. And he goes all the way back, really, from the earliest days of the so-called special military operation. I mean, why did Boris Johnson go to Kiev and say, "Yeah, don't take this deal"? Well, because they thought that, hey, for about 48 hours after the launch of the special military operation, they thought Russia was going to just wrap this up. The people remembering events in the past when the Russians or the Soviets before them would use overwhelming force and just simply crush their opponents, and it was over very quickly. And you say, hey, well, we're not going to muck around here. But it was already clear by April of 2022 that Russia hadn't really committed the resources necessary to deliver a swift knockout blow to Ukraine. And once you don't do that, once you fail to deliver a swift knockout blow, that gives NATO the opening to go on escalating. I mean, it took a long time. It's been a step-by-step process. NATO was very, very cautious, very wary of what Russia might do, and therefore they only escalated in a very slow, methodical way. Basically, we'll start off with this sending howitzers. We'll send the Patriot anti-missile defense systems. We'll send the tanks, Challenger tanks, Abrams tanks, and the and then the HIMARS and so it was always a very good, F-16s, cluster munitions. We don't have to go through all of this, but each step was very carefully monitored because they were watching what Russia was going to do. They were really very unsure, and they weren't sure how Russia will respond. And when they saw that Russia wasn't really responding, just like when they hit the Moskva in the Black Sea, and they started hitting the Black Sea fleet, they were again watched and waited. Well, how will Russia respond? So there's a problem here, which is that there've now been so many escalatory steps that NATO has taken without suffering any repercussions at all, that by now Putin's threats are just simply not taken seriously. And so when today he talked about how he's attacked Ukraine, this is really completely irrelevant. That's not the point of what you were saying last week. When you launched that intermediate range ballistic missiles, then that was a message. Not that you're going to attack Ukraine, but that you're going to attack NATO, which is what you need to do. Because there's no other way that this war is going to come to an end. Waiting for Ukraine to collapse, that could be a long wait. I mean, I dare say, you could probably work out an equation. How long will it take for Ukraine to collapse? Well, that may take a good number of years. If they're willing to go on fighting, and they seem to be willing to fight, that's going to take some time. But anyway, let me just show you what it was that Putin said today when he was asked about the Oreshnik. Let's see. Yeah. So here we have this the Oreshnik. Well, this is good. Let me show this. This is yeah. So let's all right. So here's the question. You say that Moscow responded to the long-term use of American missiles to strike Russian territory. And then Putin says twice after the response with Oreshnik. After that, ATACMS was used twice more in Kursk Oblast. So he's openly saying, yeah, ATACMS have been used twice more in Kursk Oblast. So the damage is minimal. Nevertheless, the very fact of use, of course, we cannot help but pay attention to this, especially since there is damage. Then the question, and at the same time, you emphasized that Moscow is ready to respond to further escalation from the West. And then Putin says, I didn't just emphasize it. I said we did it tonight. So Putin's really very pleased with himself. He said, yeah, I didn't just emphasize it. I said we did it tonight. And then it says, question, yes. And in this regard, a question, what measures is Russia prepared to use in this regard? And in your opinion, are there any risks? Does the use of Western missiles to strike Russian territory continue today? Then Putin says, well, you need to ask the Westerners who are doing this whether they intend to continue doing this or not. Well, the answer is yes, they do indeed intend to continue doing this. Hoping that they're going to run out of ATACMS, I think is a fairly foolish endeavor. They're not going to run out of ATACMS. They're not going to run out of missiles. They're not going to run out of weapons. They're not going to run out of bullets. They're not going to run out of artillery shells. That's all silly. Are there any risks in strikes on Russian territory? I've also spoken about this many times. Of course there are, because this means the direct involvement of Western countries their involvement in an armed conflict. The question is very, um, very, very carefully formulated, because they don't really ask what we want to know. Hey, NATO's doing this. You issued an ultimatum to NATO. NATO's defied your ultimatum. What are you going to do about it? I mean, they never ask that question. They say, well, it's not a risk. Yeah, it's a risk, all right. Well, how else? If their specialists lay out the flight mission, transmit intelligence information to themselves, and coordinate strikes on targets on the territory of the Russian Federation, well, of course there are. And I said that today they received a response. For about 2 days, our armed forces carried out a retaliatory strike. So again, retaliate, but that's not the issue. Of course, you can hit Ukraine. You've been doing this for almost 3 years. That's not the issue. But it says, so we carried out a retaliatory strike against Ukraine. And today it was quite complex. 90 missiles were used in the strike and 100 unmanned attack vehicles. 17 objects on the territory of Ukraine were hit, different ones, military, industrial, and support facilities that work for the armed forces and industrial defense enterprises. And I will emphasize once again, I want to say once again now, of course, we will respond to such acts of aggression against the Russian Federation. How and when, with what weapons, this will depend on the targets that the General Staff of the Ministry of Defense will choose. Because for each target, its own tool, one or another weapon must be used suitable for these purposes. And then, well, let's say it is pointless to strike a seemingly insignificant target with hypersonic missile, a small in volume, because it is like shooting at sparrows with a cannon. But against significant targets, we will use the means that are at our disposal, including, I also said this, we do not exclude the use of the Oreshnik against military industrial facilities or decision-making centers, including in Kiev. Bearing in mind that the Kiev authorities today, as I said, continue to strike our vitally important facilities, including in St. Petersburg and Moscow. Now, that's all very interesting because Russia is not short on missiles and weapons to hit targets in Ukraine. You don't need the Oreshnik to hit targets in Ukraine. I mean, it's not like, well, we had to get this one out because these are really big, hardened targets that something smaller, will not suffice. That was not the purpose of the Oreshnik. Russia is not short of missiles. Russia is not short of all kinds of weaponry that it can throw at Ukraine. The Oreshnik was a serious missile, and one assumed that is for the purpose of conducting a serious attack against Russia's real problem, namely NATO. So I said, we do not exclude the use of the Oreshnik against military industrial facilities or decision-making centers in Kiev. Again, you've got everything that you need in order to hit military industrial facilities or decision-making centers, including in Kiev. You don't need the Oreshnik for that. And then it's also strange, it says, well, including in Kiev, as if this is somewhat of a big deal. Oh, we're going to hit Kiev. Well, why aren't you hitting Kiev? And it says, particularly, bearing in mind that the Kiev authorities are striking our vitally important facilities, including in St. Petersburg and Moscow. So you're allowing them to strike targets in St. Petersburg and Moscow, and then you're going to get around, maybe, we might start hitting targets in Kiev. Now, it was unthinkable 2 years ago that Kiev would be striking vitally important facilities in St. Petersburg and Moscow. It was unthinkable. And yet now he just says it, they're doing it, and we might hit them in Kiev. Then there's a question. who says, "You have already told a lot about the Oreshnik today, but the Western media write that there was no explosive in the warhead of Oreshnik. And if this is really so, then what does it mean? And how can you tell us any more new detail? And can you tell us any more new details about Oreshnik? And how many secret developments of this kind do we have, as you said, on the menu? What will please the client?" And then Putin says, "You see, if I said we are conducting test launches, it means that this work is aimed, among other things, at improving this weapon. As for the strike capabilities, I have already said the same. And if several such systems are used in one strike at once, using 2, 3, 4 complexes, then it will be comparable in strength to the use of nuclear weapons. So we can use these as if they're nuclear weapons, even though they are not nuclear weapons. So, we just put them all together, and when you add up the explosive power, it'll effectively be a nuclear weapon. But I dare say there won't be the radiation. So, I mean, that's the whole point of the nuclear weapons, is that you've got the radiation that lingers on. But it is not nuclear because it is A, highly accurate, B, not equipped with a nuclear explosive device, does not contaminate the environment, but the strength will be comparable. But again, you're reading this, and it's all puzzling because, as I said, Russia is not short of firepower. You don't need this to strike blows at Ukraine's military facilities and industrial facilities. You already have everything you need. The only reason to bring this Oreshnik up, is if you're going to deal with NATO. But I mean, Ukraine, you already have the measure of Ukraine. I mean, you're 4 times the size of Ukraine. I mean, you have industrial military resources way in excess of anything Ukraine has. And then he goes on. Kinetic impact is a powerful impact, like a meteorite falling. So we've got meteorite. We know from history how and what meteorites fell, where, and what the consequences were. This was enough for entire lakes to form, right? And then blah, blah. What did the Tunguska meteorite lead to? It is known after all. Anyway, so talk has a discourse then on meteorites. The same is true here. The damage is very serious. Everything in the center turns to ash, decomposes into its constituent elements, and objects located at a depth of 3 or 4, maybe even more floors below are damaged. These are not just floors, but fortified structures. The force of the blow is colossal. Of course, you can add more, and it will be even more powerful. The main thing is that the fundamental model has been created, it works, and it works as planned by its creators. This is a precise weapon and high power. So he says this, and all very, very impressive. But the interesting thing is that NATO refuses to be impressed by this. Now, it may be NATO is being very foolish. That I am willing to grant that they're playing a very dangerous game in not taking this seriously. But just simply elaborating on all this firepower that he can unleash against Ukraine does seem, kind of a very strange response to what had happened. I mean, the point about this ATACMS was very specific. NATO is at war with Russia. Ukraine cannot fire these missiles without NATO, and therefore any attack, whether at Kursk or anywhere else, that was launched by Ukraine in the last few days was obviously an attack by NATO. It wasn't just Ukraine using ATACMS. And NATO had to have been involved in the targeting. And then here we have another question. Vladimir Vladimirovich, when you spoke about possible strikes on decision-making centers, you did not specify which centers you meant, military or political. That's the first thing. And secondly, still as the Supreme Commander in Chief, do you think that these strikes on the centers are also possible with the Oreshnik, because it seems that nothing else can reach them? Well, have there been any attempts to hit at these decision-making centers? And then Putin says, well, in Soviet times, there was a joke about weather forecasts. The forecast was today, during the day, everything is possible. So, and so that's that's from the news conference. And as I say, it's an odd response, because you don't need this Oreshnik to hit targets in Ukraine. I mean, you've got everything you need. I don't doubt Russia has plenty of missiles in its armory that can serve their purpose. They have plenty of drones. They can hit a lot of things. And again, if you want to make progress on the battlefield, you need your manpower, and you need your weaponry to accompany your offensives, and you have to have the ability to throw serious manpower when you mount your offensive, so that you can actually, when you take a village, then you can actually make it count, and press on to push your advantage, which is what happens in war. You don't just take a particular strategic location. You use that in order then to throw your heavy armory and your manpower to make that count. Otherwise, you can take a strategic location, then you're going to lose it. If you don't have the manpower to follow through, then you're just going to lose that strategic location. Anyway, so that was one thing that he talked about today. And the other thing that he talked about, he was right at the very end of the news conference. He was asked about Donald Trump. And of course, we had been waiting for this, because so far there's been, he had said very little as about Trump, and Trump himself hadn't said very much. I mean, we'll talk about the appointment of Keith Kellogg, Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, as his envoy to Ukraine and Russia in a moment. But anyway, he was asked about Trump, and at the same time, he during the election, he had been very wary about commenting on Trump. Understandably, I think that was after the debacle of 2016, when I think the Russians were quite excited about the possibility of a Trump victory, and that Trump who did not belong to the usual Washington foreign policy bubbles, and an outsider, he might take a fresh look at relations with Russia. He's a businessman. He's pragmatic. He has no ideological prejudices, and therefore they were very hopeful. And Russians being Russians, and they tended to get a little exuberant and excited. They said a little bit too much about how they were looking forward to working with Trump, and indeed declaring that we're very happy to see the back of Barack Obama. So were we, but probably it wasn't the wisest of moves to say it openly. But anyway, so this time they've been very meticulous about maintaining their silence about Donald Trump. But now he's won. There's nothing you can do to to alter the result. So today, Putin spoke, at a little bit of at some length about Trump. So let's take a look at what he said. Um, okay. Okay. So here we have a question. How much should and could the current level of escalation, which began with the Biden administration's authorization to hit Russia with ATACMS, affect the ability to establish contacts with a future Trump administration? How important will this factor be in building relations, or are there other signals that make this difficult? I find this question to be very confusing, but anyway, Putin says, we do not know what Mr. Trump and the current president discussed at their meeting. We do not know, and therefore we will not comment on this. There are different options. If the current President Biden believes that by escalating the situation, by increasing the degree of confrontation, he's creating conditions for the future administration, it is easy to get out of the situation because the newly elected president will say, it's not me, it's people who have completely lost their minds. I have nothing to do with this. Let's talk. Of course, this is an option. Okay, well, that's reasonable. Trump can absolutely say that. And again, surprising, and we've commented on this before, surprising he hasn't said anything very much, even though some of the people around him who serve at his pleasure have been talking. And then Putin goes on, it is possible that the current administration wants to create additional difficulties for the future one. This is also possible. But as far as I can imagine, the newly elected president is an intelligent and already quite experienced person. He seems to me will find a solution, especially after he has gone through such a, let's say, very serious test as the fight to return to the White House. So that's a surprisingly tone, but in a way not so surprisingly, because I do think that the Russians have been looking forward to Trump and have been hoping to work out a deal with Trump. I think that that's really what the hope is, because otherwise this war could go on for quite a while. So I think they do have hopes that Trump can somehow pull a rabbit out of a hat. And so he says he will find a solution. And then says, a very serious test as to the return to the White House. That's true. I mean, that was not an easy thing to do to win back the presidency. I think that you were also most struck not by the fact that absolutely uncivilized means of struggle were used against Trump. Absolutely uncivilized, up to and including attempted murder. And more than once, by the way, in my opinion, he's not safe now. So that's a very interesting thing to say. In my opinion, he is not safe now. So it was absolutely uncivilized means of struggle were used against Trump, up to and including attempted murder, and more than once. By the way, in my opinion, he's not safe now. There have been all sorts of different cases in the history of the United States. I think that he's an intelligent person, and I hope cautious. He understands all this. But I was more struck by the fact that during the attacks on him, during the fight against him, not only was he subjected to humiliating, unfounded procedures, legal charges, and so on, but attacks were carried out on members of his family, on his children. Um, and and then our gangsters don't do that. When criminal gangs fight among themselves, they don't touch women and children. They leave them alone. Men fight among themselves. But these guys did touch them, you know. But it's so disgusting that it once again underlines the entire decline of today's American political system. And then he concludes, nevertheless, the country is great, of course. We are ready for dialogue with the United States, including with the future administration. And that was the end of the news conference. Um, the thing about the women and children, I kind of wasn't entirely sure exactly what he referred to. I mean, the Melania and Barron were, I suppose, attacked during the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago when they were looking for these documents, and they went through her personal belongings. They went through the boys' personal belongings. You know, maybe that's what he's referring to. I mean, other than that, of course, they did make life hard for Donald Jr. He had to testify at these endless congressional investigations. You know, so at enormous length, and of course at great expense, because you need to pay for your lawyers and so on. But I don't know exactly how else were women and children under attack from Biden. I mean, other than that Mar-a-Lago raid. But this statement by Putin, I think, will almost certainly endear him to Trump. I think I think, hey, is Putin defending me from all these attacks, unfair attacks, and so I think it obviously be a plus in Trump's eyes, which I think brings us to the next subject before we go on to the addressing some of the comments, and that is the appointment of Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. It's one of these things. I mean, Kellogg is obviously, he's part of the general swamp, and he has said many things on a number of occasions. And to be honest, I mean, if we look through the various things that he has said, and I posted a couple of them. I posted an article that he wrote in the National Interest in 2023, and then the article that he co-authored with Fred Fleitz. That was in April of this year. And then, of course, there's the interview. I think Judy, posted it. Interview that he gave on Fox News the other day. You can read into it what you like. Certainly, he's made statements suggesting that his criticism of Biden was that he wasn't doing enough for Ukraine, that he was weak, that it was his weakness that had encouraged Putin to invade Ukraine, that Biden should have sent early on everything Ukraine needed, and that would have defeated Russia. So he said that. He said that he's not happy. He thinks that these ATACMS are an escalation, a dangerous escalation. On the other hand, he says, well, they should have done it a long time ago. So apparently now it's dangerous, but had he done it months ago, it wouldn't have been dangerous. And then in the article that he wrote with Fred Fleitz, he has the same kind of he berates. They berate Biden at the same time for not being open to negotiations with Russia, while at the same time they berate Biden for not doing enough for Ukraine. So it's kind of it's very confusing. They just go from one thing to another. It's just simply, any stick will do to bash Biden. Oh yeah. There were openings. You should have taken this opening. There should have been a negotiation with Putin. Then they didn't do that. Oh, and they didn't send weapons when the weapons would have made a difference. And then when it comes to what do we do now? If we're not going to rehash history, what do we do now? Then they suggest, something similar to what others have suggested, which is a ceasefire along the line of contact. Ukraine, for the time being, will not retake the territory that it has lost. However, but it will continue to make its claim on the territory it has lost. And of course, the United States will pour in, I don't know, bucketfuls of ammo into Ukraine, and then will issue all kinds of security guarantees. No NATO membership. They don't say no NATO membership. Basically, that's not going to happen. NATO will not accept this, so they're not saying there should be a NATO membership, but security guarantees for Ukraine. I guess bilateral by the United States. So when you look through this, for all of his statements from Kellogg, I mean, you can just interpret it any way you want. And so then you go back and then think about, well, what does Trump want to do? And I think I've given my view, which is I don't think Trump is going to want to bring this to any conclusion on the lines spelled out by Kellogg, because Trump will immediately be attacked by everyone as having sold out Ukraine, as having betrayed NATO, as having facilitated a Russian victory. Now, however silly that is, that's what Trump will be attacked by, and he'll be attacked by on all sides. He'll be attacked by Republicans, and he'll be attacked by Democrats. He'll be attacked by the media. Yeah, I mean the MAGA will of course want this, but Trump, that's not what Trump is now thinking. He doesn't really need MAGA anymore. He's won the election. He's a one-term president. So what's the upside for him to essentially push for an armistice, for a ceasefire in Ukraine? The only upside is saying, "Hey, well, I said I would do it, during the campaign," but he'll just get attacked for it, and I don't know that Trump wants to do that. And really, if you think of the people who brought kind of conflicts to an end in the past, they didn't get any particular praise for it. If you think of, let's say, Vietnam. Now, the escalation in Vietnam was undertaken by Kennedy and Johnson. If you think about it, if you go, America's serious involvement in Vietnam was Kennedy and Johnson. The president who finally brought to an end America's involvement in Vietnam was Nixon. Now, compared to how historians view the three presidents, Kennedy and Johnson are treated as heroes. They're in the pantheon of the great presidents. They're never taken to task for for bringing this disaster onto the United States, or not to mention the disaster they brought onto the people of Vietnam. While Nixon is continually denounced, and somehow he gets the blame for Vietnam because somehow he didn't accept a deal in 1969. That's not at all clear that there was a deal that he could have accepted in 1969, but okay, he didn't take the deal in 69. But he did finally bring the American involvement to an end. Um, so uh, you could, but he somehow is blamed for it. So he doesn't get any credit from historians for bringing the war to an end, while at the same time Kennedy and Johnson, who had escalated recklessly, um, they they're treated as heroes. So that would be like, Biden, by any rational measure, should be despised and kicked and spat upon by everyone. He has presided over two horrific wars in which America is very actively involved in both of them, and for no reason at all, because again, those were wars of choice. No real American interests were involved in either case. But it'll be Trump who will be attacked if he moves seriously to bring the to end this war. That's why I don't think he's going to do it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think he's going to expend any real political capital on doing so. And I think, on the contrary, things could get much more dangerous. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the comments by the Gagglers, the people who do the heavy lifting here. They're the ones who keep the dogs happy, or at least the dogs are never happy, but at least keep the dogs off my off my back. To the extent that they can do it. So, but anyway. So Robert, happy Thanksgiving, Robert. And it says, "Ciao, George. Gloomy and raining in the Garden State, and it's about to get dark outside." Yeah, this is this is just so awful. I mean, this is the way it is here. It is it's so dismal. So yeah. Yeah, you preaching to the choir here, Robert. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert, for your generosity. And Robert says, as I understand Ted Postel's analysis, the Oreshnik's power comes from its one-ton warhead traveling at a velocity of 3.4 kilometers per second. Energy is used to accelerate this one-ton mass in flight rather than to explode it on impact. E equals mc squared. We're getting into some serious physics here, which in this case works out around 1.5 tons of TNT equivalent. However, keep in mind that this energy is directed along a straight line path rather than dispersed spherically, as in the case of a conventional detonation. That may well be the case. I have to, take the word of experts. And so, even when Putin was talking about how the enormous power of this Oreshnik, I believed him. When he says, "Hey, this is the equivalent of a nuclear missile without the nastiness of nuclear missiles, namely the radiation." So I believe that, but I don't think that there's any purpose to this Oreshnik other than to make it clear to NATO that you are ready to get serious with them. And I don't think you even need Oreshniks to hit targets in NATO land. I think you can do it without anything as serious as this. I mean, obviously, it's an intermediate range missile, so Russia can use them against targets in NATO land. But I think Russia already has those kinds of missiles, and certainly it has the drones to hit targets in NATO land. The problem is that Putin can have these news conferences and Putin can talk and talk and talk, but NATO is not afraid. And NATO is just going to keep doing it. I mean, so we've now, he issued this warning last week about the ATACMS, and he said, hey, well, that means that essentially the NATO is at war with Russia. We reserve the right to hit military installations in NATO countries, and now what do we have is just yet again some more attacks on Ukraine's energy grid. So after this, that's not going to deter NATO. I mean, that's clearly the case. So he's not deterring NATO, and that's where I think there are problems. Anyway, thank you so much, Robert. Cynthia, always very good to see you, Cynthia. Thank you so much, Cynthia, as always, for your generosity. Cynthia says, perhaps you're right, George. The problem with biopic films. Oh yeah, so we're going back to the Nixon screening, which we had the other day. This was the Oliver Stone's 1995 movie, and I wasn't particularly impressed. As I was saying the other day, I thought the first third of the film was pretty decent, but then he went completely off the rails and presented Nixon in a very, I think, unfair and unsympathetic light. Making all sorts of aspersions and insinuations for which there's really no evidence. I mean, it's like, such as somehow Nixon was involved in the assassination of the Kennedy brothers. There's no evidence for that, none whatsoever. And the various assassinations of foreign leaders, Lumumba, Trujillo, and so on. I mean, it's just Stone was making this all sorts of dark suggestions, but this was the problem also with JFK. Now JFK, which he made, I guess it was about maybe 1990 and 1991, so a few years before Nixon, and that was focused entirely on the Kennedy assassination. But he did in the JFK the same thing. He was mixing fact with fiction. Well, you can't really do that. I mean, either you're going to do a kind of a factual based film, kind of more or less a documentary, but you stick to the known facts, or you're going to do a work of fiction. But you can't just sort of mix the two together and say, well, yeah, but I mean that it's a kind of a personal interpretation. No, I mean you're doing a work of fiction. You're confusing an audience. The audience who basically isn't that well informed about Nixon or the Kennedy assassination and will take as true what you are saying here. But anyway, Cynthia goes on. The problem with biopic films in general is that they can't stick entirely to the facts, so they might as well be pure fiction. Anyway, the purpose of biopic films is to create compelling drama, not to recreate reality. Amadeus is a good example of this. On the other hand, docudramas are documentaries that use actors to recreate reality, which is why Nixon 1995 seems more like a docudrama than a biopic. At least to me, it seems. Well, if you look at it, um, a story like Nixon, and the various aspects of the Kennedy assassination, there's already plenty of drama there. There's a lot of drama in the story of Oswald. I mean, it was a very, very, very bizarre story, um, with his attempts to defect to the Soviet Union, with his return from the Soviet Union to the United States, and uh, and the failure of the U.S. security authorities to keep tabs on Oswald after he returned from the Soviet Union. Then Oswald's attempt to go to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. Then the Cuban refused to let him in. All of these are, there's enough there to make an interesting drama. And again, Nixon's life was certainly, very dramatic. I mean, losing two siblings at a very early age, and his swift rise. It seemed like he was destined to great things, and then his political collapse in 1960 and 1962. Then his return, and then his uh, winning that historic landslide in 1972, and then throwing it all away. Just the supposed master of politics seemed completely incapable of handling a crisis that took him down. I think there's enough there, if you stick to the facts, to make a compelling drama. And there's a lot of information about him. It's not like there's a shortage of information. We have the tapes. We have just about everybody who knew him, who had dealt with him, who had worked for him, have written their memoirs about him. So you've got a lot of material to work with. You really don't need to start making stuff up. Somehow his involvement with with the mafia and Cuba and there, because then Stone is being really dishonest. Stone is attempting to whitewash his heroes, namely the Kennedys, and somehow dump everything onto Nixon. And that I think is dishonest. So, look, either you do biography, you do a biopic, or you do fiction. But I don't think you can. I don't think you can just simply make stuff up, and then shove that in with stuff that is true and for which there's a historical record, and say, oh well, I'm done. Now, the case of Amadeus, I mean that's pretty much accepted that Amadeus is a work of fiction. I mean, yes, there's the figure of Mozart, but the whole story of the murder of Mozart, I mean, that's just made up. That was completely made up. It's entirely a work of fiction. I mean, it was I think Pushkin. It was Pushkin, I think, who first came up with the story. I'm not sure, but I know Pushkin did come up with that story, or that Salieri had murdered Mozart, but Pushkin may have sort of taken it from someone else. But that's a work of fiction, and that's fine. If you want to do that, if you just want to do an entirely a work of fiction, I think that's entirely fine, because then people say, okay, well, that's just a work of fiction. We can find it interesting, amusing, entertaining, and then we can criticize it and say, hey, this is all ridiculous. But we take it as a work of fiction. But if you call a film Nixon, then people think you're making a film about Nixon. You can't then just turn around. Well, yeah, I'm being very free in my interpretation. I'm being very free with my imagination. I just don't think that's acceptable. And I think the same thing was true about JFK. He um, the thrust of JFK, that film, was that the hero was this guy Jim Garrison, who was this he was a DA in Louisiana, who basically he prosecuted a couple of businessmen for the murder of Kennedy. But it was a joke. I mean, it was ridiculous. I mean, the case was thrown out, within about 30 minutes because it was such a stupid case. I mean, the judge said, well, we can't go through with this because you don't have any evidence. So he brought this criminal charges against a few businessmen, and he didn't have any evidence that they had anything to do with the Kennedy assassination. But Stone, somehow made Garrison into a hero, and so the people who actually had made a study of the Kennedy assassination, there's all sorts of people have written books, and over the years. I mean, this is a well-trodden field. They just ridiculed Stone. They just thought this is laughable. I mean, even if there were a conspiracy involving CIA and big business to kill Kennedy, you still can't go with Jim Garrison. I mean, that's the least convincing theory of the assassination. So, I mean, at least even in that case, well, again, you have to say that people are going to watch that film and say, yeah, well, this is true. There was it was an assassination. The military and the CIA all plotted to kill Kennedy, and in a way, it's worked. I mean, there's so many people, including people that we, I think, we. I'm gonna refresh this page. I think that'll be okay. I can refresh this page. People that are otherwise quite sensible, such like a Tucker Carlson, like like Robert Barnes. They peddle this story of Kennedy having been assassinated by the CIA, and they peddle this story. And I guess Ron Paul does this. They never have any evidence. They never present any evidence other than the usual way, the circular argument. Well, we don't like the CIA. The CIA is really bad. Somebody had to have killed Kennedy. Couldn't possibly have been this frail, dweeby character, Oswald. So the CIA had to have been a part of it. Okay, why? What's the reason? What was the motive for the CIA to kill Kennedy? And that's never really explained, because basically the idea that Kennedy was this anti-establishment figure who was threatening the deep state, he was really taking on the powerful forces in the U.S. government. It's a joke. And Kennedy wasn't that. I mean, his father, bootlegger that he was, his father had been head of the SEC. He had been U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom. He was part of the Democratic Party establishment. The Bay of Pigs, he'd gone along with the Bay of Pigs. It's not like he said, hey, look, we can't go around invading Cuba and overthrowing Castro. He didn't do that. He said, he went along with the whole Bay of Pigs venture. I mean, he didn't provide, the air support that may or may not have made the difference, but he didn't do that. But nonetheless, he went along with it. So there was, Vietnam. He went along with the escalation. He planned to assassinate Castro after the failure of the Bay of Pigs. He organized the U.S. government to see to assassinating Castro. So there's just no evidence that he was some kind of a humane, I don't know, anti-war kind of figure. All of a sudden, oh wow, we've got a real peacenik in the Oval Office. That's not who JFK was. So it's very hard to see what the motive would be. Oh, he was the Vietnam. He escalated the American involvement in Vietnam. There's no evidence that he would have pulled out had he not been assassinated. I mean, the people who were around Kennedy, they all favored commit to Vietnam and to escalate Vietnam. They all stayed on with Johnson or the McNamara and Bundy, who were liberals. These are all liberals. These weren't some arch right wing hawks or anything. They were Cold War liberals. They were the ones who advised Kennedy on the escalation in Vietnam, and then they stayed on with Johnson, continue giving that same advice. So there was never any reason for the assassination of Kennedy. That's why it's a nice idea. Oh yeah, the CIA killed Kennedy, but then you say, okay, fine, and motive? What was I mean, it's a real that's a serious business to kill a president. So you got to come up with a strong motive. There was a movie made in the 1970s, and one of these. I mean, the heyday of the paranoid films. There was a real craze for the paranoid films of the 70s. What was the Parallax View, the one with Warren Beatty? A really lousy film. I took a look at it again the other day. I thought, well, maybe we had underestimated it. Maybe it's better than I remember it. No, it's even worse than I remember it. But there was another one in that genre, was Executive Action. And that was about the Kennedy assassination. I can't remember what year it was made, but maybe 72. And I think Robert Ryan was in it. And that did the same thing. It mixed fact with fiction. So it used real, actual footage, documentary footage of Kennedy, and then mixed it with all kinds of sinister Texas businessmen meeting, drinking their whiskeys as they plan to kill Kennedy. But again, then we're having difficulties. Well, what's the motive? Why are these Texas businessmen so upset with Kennedy? What is Kennedy doing that is so detrimental to the interests of these Texas businessmen? And then they talk about the oil depletion allowance. That whole big issue of the time was this oil depletion allowance, that somehow the big oil giants were getting a tax break because of their depletion of their resources, and Kennedy was trying to reduce that depletion allowance. And again, the oil companies weren't particularly happy. But for God's sake, I mean, that's just penny ante stuff. That's just a regular thing that goes on in American politics. I mean, FDR did a hell of a lot more than Kennedy did. I mean, FDR was a real radical. Kennedy was not a radical. If that's the best you've got, Kennedy wanted to reduce the oil depletion allowance. It's not a convincing case. But that was executive action. Take a look at it. Stone's JFK was kind of in that genre. Executive action, I guess, didn't quite he didn't get into as much trouble as Stone did, because they just outright made it up. They just made up these Texas businessmen plotting to kill Kennedy. But with JFK, Stone, idolized this Jim Garrison, and that kind of got him into trouble, because there are people who've been writing about the Kennedy assassination over the years, and they have absolutely ridiculed Jim Garrison, and they all basically turned on the film and said that you are not serious. You're not seriously going to take your bearings from Jim Garrison. Anyway, Cynthia then goes on. But that doesn't mean docudramas are true either. They are not, but they are created with an intention of trying to portray what happened and using various tools to get there. And one of those tools that Oliver Stone used for the film is actual newsreels and voice recordings, and he incorporated many scenes throughout the film. And how he portrayed what happened had a lot to do with his own interpretation of events, whether they're based on facts or not. Well, that's I mean, okay, his interpretation of events. The problem is, can you do that if you write a book? Let's say you write a book about Nixon, and then you shove in all the stuff that Stone shoved in. Then people are going to read it and say, "Well, this is a load of crap." Basically, you don't have any evidence to support it. You just make stuff up. So if that and the book would just be dismissed, they say, "Oh, this is a load of crap." Now, a film doesn't get dismissed because, of course, a film is geared towards a popular audience, and ultimately, films can get away with it because, in a way, no one really takes films seriously. People kind of assume films are entertainment. And that's why you can do this sort of thing on film. If you try to write a book, then I mean you could do it, but then if Oliver Stone writes a book about Nixon, then we say, well, this is a work of fiction. That you created a fictional character called Nixon, you've made stuff up, and then you presented it as an interpretation, and then people who know the era will say, well, okay, it's a work of fiction. Doesn't have much bearing on reality, but no one would take it seriously. But because a film is entertainment, and a film reaches a much wider audience, you are confusing people, and they're not really sure. Are you watching a fact? Are you watching a documentary or a film based on actual events? Or are you making stuff up? So in that film, you kind of bring in E. Howard Hunt, and again, you making stuff up about a connection between Nixon and E. Howard Hunt, and then you bring in this guy who was played by Larry Hagman, some guy called Jack Jones. He was completely made up. He's very sinister, and he's the one who starts threatening Nixon. Again, they're all having drinks. That's it. In all these films, these sinister characters are all sitting there drinking their whiskey and issuing threats. But it's it's made up, and I mean, you can do a work of fiction. You can make a film about a fictional president who is clearly based on Nixon. I think no one would have any problems. But I think if you call something Nixon, then I think it is a problem. Look, Gore Vidal made that. Well, he wrote a play, and then he was made into a film. Very good, very good. I haven't seen the play, but I saw the film, and I think I even reviewed it here. The Gaggle, The Best Man, and there was a character who was obviously based on Nixon. It was Joe Cantwell. He was played by Cliff Robertson, very ruthless and opportunistic character. And then you had a the Henry Fonda playing um, the Adlai Stevenson character. So there was it was basically a kind of they were both seeking the nomination of the party, I guess, Democratic Party. So there was the good guy, the Adlai Stevenson guy. People watching it know, yeah, that's a guy. He's based on Adlai Stevenson. And then they look at Joe Cantwell and they say, yeah, that's a guy. He's based on Nixon. And that's fine. I mean, no one has any problem. You can say, well, this is, but the Joe Cantwell is presented in a very unflattering light. This is not this isn't very nice, and not really very accurate about Nixon. But at least everyone knows, this is a work of fiction. He didn't call the Joe Cantwell character Dick Nixon, and he didn't call. I think his name was Russell. The name with was it Russell? Yeah, I think the Russell character, Adlai Stevenson. And so it was entertaining, and we all knew it was a work of fiction. But I think when you mix facts with fiction, and then people don't know, well, what's actual fact and what is just simply your own stuff made up. I think that's not really, that I don't think that's acceptable. So now, but if we talk about the aesthetics of the film, and I think there are also problems with that, because I don't think Anthony Hopkins got Nixon right. Nixon is very distinctive, and this is Marty very, very generously and very scrupulously has posted the all of the interviews of David Frost with Nixon in the late 1970s. So they're all on the Gaggle locals board. They're there, available. You can download them. I mean, it's really fantastic. But if you watch that, you can see how Nixon had a very distinctive way of speaking. He had very distinctive cadences. How he would speak, the words he would emphasize, his pauses, the way he would move as when he spoke. It was very distinctive, and he had a very distinctive kind of baritone voice. Hopkins didn't do any of that, and he always had him kind of hunched over. He would always do this hunching over. But the only reason he did that is because that's how cartoonists, who all hated Nixon, they always portrayed Nixon kind of hunched over. He's always got this hunching over, and so he did this hunching over, which Nixon didn't do. So, if we just focus on the aesthetics, I thought it was a little disappointing. I thought there could have been better actors. I don't know why Stone decided to with Anthony Hopkins. Hopkins, I think, also had difficulties with the accent, and as did Bob Hoskins, who played J. Edgar Hoover. They had real difficulties again getting an American accent. And so, I would venture that there were American actors who would have done a better portrayal of Nixon. I think something like Gene Hackman would have done a better job. Maybe even Jack Nicholson would have done a better job. So if you just think about the aesthetics of the film, that was a little disappointing. But I'm glad we screened it. I think it's a good, since the theme was political biopics. I think that's a good example and something to mull over. So anyway, thank you, Cynthia. Robert says, for comparison, the U.S. Army's W-54, are we going back to the missiles, was the lowest yield tactical nuke of around 10 TNT ton equivalent. But again, this energy would be dispersed rather than directed. Okay. I mean, Yes, I mean, I don't doubt that it has enormous capabilities. Um, but at this stage, the issue has to be: are you willing to use it? You don't have to have, you don't have to put in a lot of warheads or anything like that. Are you willing to use it as a clear warning to NATO? Because what he did in Dnipropetrovsk last week did not do the job. The job was to deter NATO. It didn't have that effect at all. They're using these ATACMS with very cheerfully. No one is terribly bothered with what Putin did. So, I'm quite sure that this is a formidable missile. Or, this, as far as at least I can judge. But the issue is ultimately: are you going to make NATO pay? Because at the moment, NATO is just having a good time. I mean, it's not suffering any casualties. The American, military-industrial complex is humming along nicely. Europeans are not humming along nicely, but the Americans are humming along nicely. Um, why end it? What's really so terrible for America? Again, Vietnam was very different. America was suffering serious casualties. American society was being torn asunder by the protesters. People who didn't want to go and serve in Vietnam. That was a real big deal. I mean, that was a real pressure on America to bring it to an end. But there's no pressure at all in America. In fact, the overwhelming consensus, with the exception of maybe J.D. Vance and Marjorie Taylor Greene, is we need to do more for Ukraine. We should have removed these restrictions on the ATACMS ages ago. Even Keith Kellogg said this. So I just don't see the pressure. I don't get the pressure that supposedly is being applied against Trump to bring this to a conclusion. It's very, very different from the case of Vietnam. Anyway, Cynthia goes on and says the Khrushchev thaw is described as such because his policies involve de-Stalinization and peaceful coexistence with other nations. Yes. But how can Brezhnev be described as putting an end to the thaw when the 1973 summit he had with Nixon is widely regarded as the high watermark in détente between the USSR and the US? It seems rather contradictory to paint Brezhnev as someone who refroze the Cold War when he actually was thawed down quite a bit. I think it's an excellent point. I think you're making excellent points there. The Khrushchev, there are two aspects of the Khrushchev thaw. One was that relations between the Soviet Union and the West improved, but the other aspect was that the repression at home was eased. So, under Stalin, there was quite serious repression. I mean, people were sent to the Gulag. I mean, there was a huge, uh, prison complex. It was called the Gulag. So I don't know how many were in prison. Maybe millions or hundreds of thousands in the Gulag at the time of Stalin's death, and they were released gradually after Stalin's death. So the Gulag emptied out. Khrushchev also eased up on the political censorship. So he published, or under Khrushchev, Solzhenitsyn was published. I mean, the One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich was published under Khrushchev, and he denounced Stalin's repression at his at the 20th Congress, and specifically he was uh, uh, repressing and persecuting and killing, executing good communists. That's what Khrushchev said. He was good communists. So that was a part of the thought. Now, you have to keep in mind that when Khrushchev, in the last days of Khrushchev, the relations between the Soviet Union and the West actually were in steep decline. Yeah, there was relations improved, um, and he came to the Khrushchev came to the United States, and he met Eisenhower in Camp David, and then Khrushchev went to Hollywood and watched the making of Can. But then you had a gradual deterioration. So we had, in 1960, we had the U-2 spy flight over the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev had the U-2 plane shot down. This, of course, infuriated him, and then which also led to the breakdown of the disarmament, the 1960, the big disarmament conference, and then led to Khrushchev's famous, or rather infamous, tirade. He was in such a foul mood because this happened just as the U-2 flight was shot down. So he really absolutely unleashed this rage against the West and Western journalists, and then of course 1961, when there was the Bay of Pigs debacle, and of course there was the Berlin crisis, which, and again, this was causing Khrushchev real problems, which is relations between the Soviet Union and the United States were deteriorating, first of all over Berlin, and then of course after the Bay of Pigs, and then it was the disastrous Vienna summit with Khrushchev and Kennedy, when Khrushchev just started treated him with absolute contempt and started yelling at Kennedy, and then of course 1962 we have the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the last few years of Khrushchev's rule, there was no thaw. I mean, this was the relations were as bad as they were in the last years of Stalin's life. Now, relations did improve after Khrushchev's ouster. Relations gradually began improving between the United States and the Soviet Union. And Kosygin, he visited the United States. This was 1967. He was in Glassboro, New Jersey, and which Robert probably knows where it is. I'm not sure I know where it is. And that, so boom, the launching of those SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitations talks. This is all part of the détente, and it led to the first visit ever of a U.S. president to the Soviet Union, not counting, of course, the Yalta Conference, but the first ever of Nixon, when Nixon visited the Soviet Union in 1972 and signed the SALT and the ABM treaties. So you're absolutely right. Détente continued under Brezhnev. In fact, détente really flourished under Brezhnev, much more so than under Khrushchev. But there was more repression at home than there was under Khrushchev. So, Solzhenitsyn was no longer, his work was no longer getting published. The dissidents were not getting their stuff published. And, dissidents were being sent to prison. Some were sent into these psychiatric hospitals. And then some were just simply getting kicked out of the country. Solzhenitsyn was just kicked out of the country. And Andrei Sakharov, he was sent into exile. So there was more repression, but still, it's important to remember that however much more repression there was under Brezhnev, was nothing to compare with what it was like under Stalin. So it was still, in a way, a thaw, because it's not like they went back to the Stalin era. It's just that they thought that Khrushchev had kind of lost control, allowing publications like Solzhenitsyn. It was just, hey, we can't go down this path, but they weren't going to go back to the Stalin era. But the relations were as good in those years between the West and the Soviet Union as they had ever been. I can't think of any era when, maybe I guess during the years of the wartime alliance. Um, so, um, yeah, they were far better than they were under Khrushchev, because the West was very wary of Khrushchev. I mean, he was this ferocious guy. When he would bang his shoe on the table, when he was speaking at the United Nations, as I said, when he yelled and bullied Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs. And so he was seen as a terrifying figure. And that news conference in Paris, when he was just simply going absolutely just ferocious, he was attacking these German journalists. I've looked on YouTube to find this news conference. They do have that. You can find on YouTube that news conference in Paris at the breakdown of this disarmament conference, but they don't have the whole of that news conference, because when he just goes into this violent tirade against the Germans. So he was quite terrifying. Again, Stalin never talked like that. So this was really the last few years of Khrushchev's life. Not life, last few years of Khrushchev in power. And so relations were really quite bad between the Soviet Union and the West, whereas I think under Brezhnev, kind of amicable. And so nothing really changed that. It was Brezhnev who sent in the Red Army to deal with the Czechoslovakia, and that didn't affect détente. It didn't affect relations with the Soviet Union one bit. It was just, hey, you got to do what you got to do. And so anyway, but I absolutely agree with you. I mean, that's such an oversimplification to say that Brezhnev put an end to the thaw. Anyway, thank you so much, Cynthia. And then Stone River, thank you, Stone River, says, the West seems to believe, one, the logic of mutually assured destruction still prevails, so Russia will never use nuclear weapons to any significant degree. Two, the West has overwhelmingly superior conventional military power over Russia. Yeah. Three, therefore, the West can safely keep provoking Russia and escalating the conflict until it brings Russia to its knees and forces regime change and a breakup, etc. Is there a flaw in this thinking? No, I think you've summarized it really, really well. The logic of mutually assured destruction, the way it worked was that because I mean, it wasn't just enough. Okay, well, if you release the nuclear weapon, then we will. But that was never. It was never plausible, and no one really ever tried it. It was never plausible that either side would use nuclear weapons. I mean, it was there. People said, "Oh, well, a mutually assured destruction, and we'll keep it in place." But nobody really wanted to mess with it, even though, common sense would tell you, yeah, but you're not going to use nuclear weapons. We know you're not going to use nuclear weapons, so therefore, the threat of using nuclear weapons is a hollow one. But what worked was that everyone pretended to believe in it. And by pretending to believe in it, it meant that you didn't start a conventional war. It's not a question of whether the Russians have stronger conventionally or the Americans, because during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was believed to have a much stronger conventional forces than the West did. But nobody thought that the Soviet Union would unleash its conventional forces against the West even though it was likely to win in the short term, the Soviet Union would win a conventional war against the West. That's what it was believed because it was much larger. Because any conventional war was bound to lead to a nuclear war. And therefore, again, they would say that's mutually assured destruction. So if you have a nuclear weapon, anyone who resorts to nuclear weapons then knows that they're going to get hit with a nuclear weapon. No one is ready for that. Therefore, mutually assured destruction is king. But of course, it was always lacking in credibility because nobody believed it. And that's the problem now, and why Putin is having so many difficulties, that he's talking about using nuclear weapons. He hasn't said it explicitly, but he's sort of suggesting it. But nobody believes it. He's not going to, why would he use nuclear weapons when he knows we have nuclear weapons? And then, if he releases one of them, we're gonna hit him with our nuclear missiles. So he's not going to do it. He's not crazy. He's not going to order kind of national suicide or the mass killing of his own people. So it lacks the credibility. It always lacked credibility. But it's just that during the Cold War, people pretended to believe it. What has happened now is that the West no longer believes it, no longer pretends to believe it. And it doesn't even think that it needs to pretend to believe it because the West thinks Russia is very weak. And this has really been the problem ever since the end of the Cold War, which is that the West has never believed that Russia is strong enough as an equal in the way that they thought the Soviet Union was an equal. And this has really driven Putin crazy because he wants Russia to enjoy the respect that the Soviet Union enjoyed. But the West isn't going to accord Russia that same respect. And that's why the West has been taking the risks, the kind of risks that it wasn't willing to take in the case of the Soviet Union. And that's why he thinks, hey, we can go on provoking Russia in the way that they were never prepared to provoke the Soviet Union. And the more they watch this war that is going on and on, the more the West is convinced that they've chosen the right course. Lavrov wrote an interesting essay maybe 2 or 3 months ago. It's up on the Russian Foreign Ministry site, and it was about the wartime negotiations. I mean, it's quite interesting, but a lot of it is well known. But what he said in that essay was quite interesting, which was that the West started making concessions to Stalin only after Stalingrad. It's only after the Red Army began scoring its huge victories and destroying the Wehrmacht, then the West decided that, the British and the Americans decided that they needed to make concessions. And so the various wartime agreements and all the agreements about Eastern Europe, about Poland, and so on, reparations and everything, that was only came about after the Soviet Union showed its great military strength. Up until then, Stalin was making all sorts of demands. They were not going to meet those demands. So that's the problem for Russia. But Russia wants a kind of respect from the West. The West isn't going to give it to them. And now, when you say the West can say, yeah, that's why the West can safely keep provoking Russia. They don't think Russia is going to resort to nuclear weapons. It's just that they think that this is just empty talk. And they don't think Russia is conventionally very strong. And in fact, the longer this war goes on, they say, well, you're basically getting You're getting exhausted. That it take 3 years of fighting. It takes its toll. And then so until it brings Russia to its knees and forces regime change. I think that's more or less the plan. More or less the plan. And I think that and that's long-term thinking. I think it's part of a kind of a Western anti-Russia tendency. They've been seeking to destroy, degrade, demolish Russia for centuries. The Soviet era was a kind of an aberration because under the Soviet rulers, particularly under Stalin after World War II, suddenly Russia was as strong, if not stronger, than it had ever been, and they enjoyed that respect. But it was brief. It was it didn't last very long. And what's clear is that after the end of the Cold War, the West essentially wanted unconditional surrender from Russia. I think the West was rather frustrated that the West was obviously convinced that we won the Cold War. We absolutely wiped the floor with them. We won the Cold War just like we won World War II, won World War I. We won unconditional surrender. And they didn't get it. And so when they didn't get that unconditional surrender, the West moved on to phase two, which was to surround Russia with hostile states and force that unconditional surrender from Russia. So it basically just gives up. And I think that's the project. To secure from Russia that unconditional surrender that Russia did not give in 1991. So I think that's why because this is such a long-term project, and clearly goes it's very, very deeply ingrained in the West, in the UK, in the Western Europe, in the United States. That's why I think it's just naive to think Trump is going to toss all that away and chart a new course. No, this is very deeply ingrained. And forces regime change, well, something like that. That they get a regime installed in Moscow that will surrender. They'll just basically, accept the rule over Russia of the West. Anyway, Anyway, thank you so much, Stone River. Jonathan says Iran called off its retaliation towards Israel and said Trump's plan to end wars in the Middle East sounded appealing. Well, I suppose we'll see. We'll see whether with the team that he has in place will end the wars. I don't know whether surrounding yourself with Israel first is the best way to do it, but let's. I think Iran, like Russia, are hoping and praying that maybe something good will come from Trump. It's understandable. I mean, if you're a leader of a country, you have to hope for the best, but you have to be realistic. Anyway, Jonathan asked, Merkel has a phobia of dogs, even Labradors. Yep, they're the sweetest dogs ever. We've got 2 silver labs. No, I think that's a very interesting. I mean, she obviously has. I guess if it's true that she was bitten by a dog as a child, then maybe you suffer a trauma for the rest of your life, and you're scared of dogs. But where I find it dubious is that Putin knew about this, and that Putin deliberately then sent in a Labrador. Well, keep in mind, I mean, back in the day, I mean, it's hard to remember so long ago when Russia and the United States were very friendly under Putin. Remember Putin and George W. Bush had good relations, and I think when George W. Bush, I think, visited Putin, I think Putin again, I think he sent in the same dog, this dog, and of course or maybe some other dog. Um, but this endeared Putin to George W. Bush. Bush really liked dogs, and dogs, usually, it's a way of endearing yourself to another leader or another person. Hey, we have something in common. We share a love of dogs, and as you say, labs are really are the gentlest and sweetest dogs. So if you want to establish a rapport with someone, you send in a lab. Uh, but again, it's so bizarre that after all the 20 years, Merkel is still nursing that grudge about the goddamn dog. And it's still somehow, oh, Putin sent in this dog because he knew I have a phobia of dogs. It's just it's the childishness of this person is just quite extraordinary. Anyway, Marty, oh yeah, there's that savage hounds. Marty, good evening. Thank you for your generosity, Marty, and thank you, Marty, for posting that great record of the Frost Nixon interviews. I mean, there's many hours there, so and I strongly advise, particularly after the Nixon screening the other day, that people should listen to those interviews because Nixon talks. I mean, about Watergate, but he talks about his relations with Russia, with Soviet Union rather, with China, and a lot of personal reflections as well. Talks about Kissinger. So it's a really interesting. It's a great historical record because Nixon tended to be more candid than other politicians, and certainly more candid than any previous president. So he was quite open about certain things, such as his you know lack of enthusiasm for Israel. So absolutely, I would recommend everyone to listen to those tapes. So it's a great historical record. So thank you, Marty, for posting it. Anne Marie, thank you so much. Thank you for your generosity. Always very good to see you. Carlos, at this point, are the Russians being patient or idiotic? No, that's a. It's a hard one. I I think it's kind of a hope springs eternal. If I was thinking of what they think, what's really going on in their minds, they're putting all their faith into Trump. And I think Putin's very warm words today about Trump, I just suspect that's what they're thinking of. That somehow maybe we can get out of this mess with Trump. Trump can will allow Trump to come up with a plan, and then they'll say, all right, well, that's a peace plan, okay, and in exchange for accepting a peace plan, even though it's detrimental to our interests, maybe we can have good relations with the United States. Something Russia really wants, Putin really wants, and I think that's something like the hope, and that Russians will then, because of the good relations that they'll get with the United States, because of that, Russians will forgive a government that led them into this war and in which they suffered so many casualties. I think that's, I'm speculating here, but I think that's probably what they're thinking. I don't think that's what's going to happen. That's my view. That's not what's going to happen. I don't think that's what Trump's going to do. But I can understand. I mean, if you're a Russian leader and you're looking around for some hopeful signs, then this is the best you've got. Trump, who has said he's going to bring this war to an end. He has said, he wants a nationalist, populist agenda. He's not interested in any globalism. He's not interested in interventionism. He's not interested in fighting stupid wars. But then you have to say, look at the team he surrounded himself with. Um, but I think that, so when you say patient or idiotic, I mean, I don't quite think I think they're being, I don't know, maybe foolishly hopeful. I think but that's the best that you've got. I mean, you have to hope for something, and I think that's what they're doing. But I think they'll be disappointed. Anyway, Robbie Michael says, yes, in reality, it will take significant attack on a non-Ukrainian NATO country. Yeah, exactly. The question is, will Russia do so, and is it willing to do so? If it does, so, it may prevail. If it does not, it will fail. Yeah, I agree. I agree. If you don't do anything, we just know NATO's just going to keep doing it. NATO's just going to keep um, applying the pressure and basically they will think, hey, we can take them on. We can just keep humiliating and degrading Russia, because if Russia doesn't do anything, then Russia is already no longer a great power. If you're a great power, no one dares to bomb your country. I mean, that's what distinguishes a great power from the lesser powers. If you're North Vietnam, or you're Syria, or you're Iraq, or you're Libya, or Yugoslavia, you get bombed. You get thumped. And there's nothing really that you can do. You don't have the means to hit back at the countries that bomb you. Now, Russia does have the means, but Russia doesn't have the will to hit back at the countries that bomb them. But that's the same thing. If you don't have the will to do so, then you cease to be a great power. The great powers, have the will to bomb you. They're not afraid of you. You don't have the will to hit back. You are afraid of them. That's it. You cease to be a great power. And that, then you can say, mission accomplished. So that's very dismal. Anyway, Robert says, given the 3 assassination attempts on Trump, you have to wonder. Just missed it. Yeah. You have to wonder whether his selection of so many neocons is an insurance policy until inauguration date, at which point Trump will return to his campaign pledge of peace and neo-isolationism. I think that's wonderful. I love Robert. I love your theory. I think that's the one drawback is that what happens then? He's in power. I mean, just because you're president doesn't mean that you're safe. You can have a secret service that's asleep at the switch, and so presidents can be assassinated just as much as presidents-elect can. I'd say, and I think this is what Michael Flynn has said, that Trump should absolutely hire his own personal, private secret service now and when he takes the oath of office. Don't rely on the secret service. Those people, they're not your friends. So he should have his own secret service, his own private army, pay out of his own pocket, or get Elon Musk. I'm sure Elon Musk would be happy to finance Trump's personal secret service. I think it's also interesting that Putin said, "Hey, I don't think he's safe." So yeah, I think that's there are so you're right. 3 assassination attempts. One of them really came close. I mean, it's quite shocking even to think about just how close the one in Pennsylvania came to killing him, and it's quite stunning. I mean, it actually hit his head, and so yeah, he needs to absolutely get his his own personal secret service there. But it's a nice idea that he'll returned to his campaign pledge of peace and neo-isolationism. I love that. Thank you on this Thanksgiving Day. Very, you're giving thanks, to hope and aspiration. Um, Carlos says, "Did you ever watch the documentary JFK Revisited by Stone?" No, I didn't. No, I didn't. Um, I remember after the movie came out, there was and the movie was obviously attacked by all the Kennedy scholars, the assassination scholars, and there was a debate in New York um, between Stone and Edward J. Epstein. Edward J. Epstein, who I think wrote one of the earliest books about the Kennedy assassination, but it was more or less about the Warren Commission, the investigation, and I think it was called Inquest. Yeah, I think it was called Inquest. It was really about the Warren Commission. And what was interesting there was that Stone really made almost no attempt to defend himself. So it really wasn't much of a debate. He made no real attempt to defend the claims that he made in the film. And Epstein, I think, was so awed by the Hollywood glamour of Stone that he didn't make much of an effort to argue his case. So it was really almost like a pillow fight. You were expecting this fireworks. It was a very well attended debate. You were expecting fireworks, but you got a pillow fight. So, but I haven't seen this documentary. I'm going to look that up and see about that documentary. Marty asks, "What did you think of Oliver Stone's Putin interview? I enjoyed the Doctor Strangelove gift. What is the Doctor Strangelove gift? Let's see. There's a link here, but I need to look that up. Or is it? Or that maybe that? Okay, there's another link. Okay. I thought they were good. I thought they were really interesting. I downloaded them. The Stone Putin interviews. I think. Oh, have I? No. Okay. All right. So I go back. I guess that's the link. Well, my recollection, and I don't know, I mean, is that um, because Stone talked about this, and Stone said that he discussed Doctor Strangelove with Putin, and Stone says to his astonishment, Putin had never seen Doctor Strangelove, and then they watched the film together. Um, and I have to say, I am also astonished that Putin had never seen Doctor Strangelove. Um, and but I can't remember now whether Putin liked the film or he didn't. He didn't. Like, all right, all right. Let me go back. I think I clicked on the wrong link. Let me try this. Click on this link. YouTube watch. Oh yeah, this is so okay. This is from the interview. Watch this later. Yep. Yeah. No. So that was just my yeah. This is about 8 minutes. I'm gonna watch this afterwards. They watched Doctor Strangelove together. But but it was surprising, and I think Stone himself was surprised that Putin had never seen the film. And then Dan Aykroyd says, that's not Dan, Robert says, Dan Aykroyd did a pretty good impression of Nixon on SNL. Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, it was obviously very mean about Nixon, but he did a very good impression of Nixon. He did an even better impression of Jimmy Carter. I mean, that's one you can find on YouTube, I think, where there was a kind of a phone-in, you phoned in a question to Jimmy Carter, and because Jimmy Carter was such a nerd and he kind of studied everything and master of detail, whatever question people asked Jimmy Carter, he always had an answer. Like somebody had, the boiler in my house isn't working. Can you tell me why my boiler isn't working? I'm cold. And then Carter said, "Well, you tell me, is it, what model is it? Or it's this model." Yeah, well, if this model, the way you have to do it is you have to put, use this and then and then tilt the switch and that's it. So he knew about different models of boilers. So he was this kind of nerdy guy who just knew the details about everything, and he kind of captured something about Carter. He was very nerdy and kind of boring. But he was very studious. He read all his briefing papers. Mastered all the details. He just wasn't a very effective leader. But he was a very good. That he did a very good. Ackroyd did a very good Jimmy Carter, and yeah, he did he did a good one of Nixon again. I think he did get the cadenzas of the distinctive cadenzas of Nixon right. And then Marty says, always hated the lazy disclaimer based on the true story. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's, based on the true story. Well, what does that mean? And again, with all these stories, there's already so much you can do with it. I mean, the story of Nixon is really interesting as it is, with all that we know about it. You can make a really interesting story without making stuff up. And that's that's the problem. And I think if you do, as I said to Cynthia, I think if you are going to call a film Nixon, then I think you have an obligation to stick to facts. Oh, you could just you can make the film about a fictional president, and you can say, oh yeah, that's based on Nixon, but then it's a fictional president. But I don't think it's you could just get away with it and say, oh well, it's Nixon based on a true story. Anyway, thank you. I think my time is expired. Thank you, everybody who joined me. Thank you for all the really interesting, fascinating points, really stimulating discussion today. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody who contributed to the tip jar, because those hounds, they're just not gonna they're not gonna stop. They're like NATO. They just don't stop. They just keep growling and growling and growling. They don't take my bluff seriously, and it's always just very, very hard to deal with them. So tomorrow is going to, the day after is always the most painful one. Having to explain myself to those hounds, and with the cold weather, they're in a worse mood than ever. So anyway, that's my problem. Thank you, everybody. We're going to do some podcasts over the weekend, and then Monday we do the live stream with Peter, 10 a.m. Eastern time, and then Tuesday, it's my own solo. Hope to see you all on Monday and on Tuesday. So thank you very much for tonight. See you very soon. All the best. Good night. Bye-bye.